Okay, here is a fun little exercise to demonstrate how OpenAI's O1 model, which is for chain of thought and reasoning, can work for you on more complex and elaborate queries. So it's just a bit of interest for me. Within Koala, we're helping buying teams to buy technology. And here are a couple of stats that came out of Sixth Sense's 2024 Buyer Experience Report. The average size of a buying group is 10.9 people, so nearly 11 people. And the average length of a buying cycle is 11 and a half months. So just thinking through, well, what does it cost for a company to run a buying process? That runs over the course of nearly a year. It's got 11 people in it. They probably interview or meet with about 4 different vendors. One of those they take through to actual contract negotiation. So how would we go about evaluating the cost of running that? So I'm in ChatGPT's O1 model, which is the reasoning, not O1 Pro, which has just come out, but this is just the standard O1. And my query is, I'd like you to help me calculate an estimate for what it costs for a company to run a buying process for new technology. In our example, we're thinking about the purchase of a new enterprise technology, such as a payroll system or a customer service platform. And then here are those stats. Typically, it's 11 people. Typically, it takes 11 and a half months. Typically, companies have 4 vendors on their shortlist, and they take one through to a verbal commitment, run a POC, and a customer reference calls. We'll need to make some assumptions about the roles involved, but we can assume some senior leaders as an executive sponsor or budget holder. The majority of the buying group would be a manager, director levels, and then some individual contributors that might be the users, admins, technical support. So that could be your legal or infosec, for example. We'll also need to make some assumptions about salaries for these roles. Perhaps you've got access to some benchmarks by accessing the web. By using your knowledge of a typical buying process, the required internal work and meetings with vendors, and potential travel for in-person meetings, I'd like you to make an estimate for what it costs to run a buying process like this. And so this is where O1 comes in with its sort of chain of thought. And what you'll find at the top of every response is actually the process it went through. So if I click on that, you get a really interesting insight into what the system is doing. So starting off, I'm formulating a budgeting strategy. I'm mapping out the steps required to calculate the cost of running this procurement process. Next, I'm assessing the time commitment. I'm estimating the time spent on meetings and vendor demos for each role in the 11 and a half month procurement process, and I'm going to use US salaries to quantify the costs. Then I'm going to track the senior leaders. I'm estimating they're going to spend about 27 hours each on these things. Then I'm going to estimate the manager and director engagement, 72 hours. Then I'm estimating the individual contributor roles, 42 hours for each of them. Then I'm going to crunch the numbers. So now I know the hours. So what does that come to? And coming to an estimate of about $38,000. Then I'm going to assess some travel requirements. So maybe we're going to meet a vendor or a customer as part of a reference. I'm going to assess the travel for that. And then I'm going to put together some variables, which suggests an overall cost estimate of between $50,000 and $100,000. So if we see how that comes through into the actual response, you can see how ChatGPT is following this along. Below is a step-by-step approach to arrive at a rough cost estimate. There's 11 people involved, and it's making some assumptions about how many people and how that is split out across the different levels of seniority. 11 and a half months, typical annual compensation benchmark. So for a senior leader, of course, it's going to vary by different industries and locations, but for a rough estimate, you could say $250,000 a year, fully loaded cost, $125 an hour. Manager or director, $150,000, individual contributor, $100,000. Then we look at how much time is invested per role. You can really see it breaking it down. So for a senior leader, so this might be your executive sponsor, well, there could be some key checkpoint meetings every month or bi-monthly over the 11 months. So that's 11 hours of commitment. Attending major vendor demos, final selection and negotiation, multiplied by their hourly rate. So for 2 leaders, we're talking about $7,500 of spend there. For the managers and directors, there's 4 of them, slightly more meetings, and that's going to bring up $21,000 of cost. Individual contributors, 5 of them, At $50 an hour, well, that's 11,250. So the labor cost, 39,750. And I have to say, from my experience of being on both sides of the table, I think that's a significant underestimate. I think there's a lot more meetings and a lot more work that happens around these meetings that would bump that up. Additional costs, if there was any travel, so maybe that is flying off to a company event that the vendor is hosting, maybe it is going to go meet a customer reference site. Maybe there's some additional legal and procurement support. Again, I think that's quite a low estimate there. But then the total estimated cost comes up to 51,250 as a rough estimate. But as it says, this is a very conservative estimate. Depending on complexity, it could easily rise. If you've got more vendor demos, longer proof of concepts, any additional travel or executive involvement, and any third-party consultants that get included would add to that cost. But given the typical complexity, a range of 50 to 100,000 in internal costs is very plausible for a mid to large enterprise, a month-long buying process for a new system. I think that's a very well thought through exercise, and it would be easy for me to add in some of my own context if I had different salaries or I felt that there were additional parts of the process to expand on that. But I'll certainly be using that as the core of the calculation to some of the total cost that I'll be using in my own estimates.